The American experiment, born of high Enlightenment ideals and enshrined in the soaring rhetoric of liberty and equality, was a house built on a fundamental self-betraying contradiction. By the mid-19th century, this flaw, slavery, had widened into a chasm, splitting the nation's soul and poisoning its political life. The land of the free was also the largest slaveholding republic in the modern world, a paradox known euphemistically to its beneficiaries as the peculiar institution. This peculiarity was not merely a regional tradition, it was the economic bedrock of the American South. From the sun-baked fields of Texas to the humid swamps of the Carolinas, the cultivation of king cotton powered a global market. A network of planters, factors, and financiers, both north and south, relied on the unpaid, brutal labor of nearly 4 million enslaved men, women, and children. The worth of these human beings, chattel property under the law, was greater than the value of all factories, railroads, and banks in the entire North combined. To the Southern planter, slavery was not a detachable social custom but a property right, a necessity for economic survival and, increasingly, a civilization to be defended at all costs. Yet, as the South dug in its heels, a nascent, powerful force began to gather momentum in the North, the moral fault line. For decades, abolitionism had been the realm of a fervent few, dismissed by mainstream politicians as dangerous radicals. But the Second Great Awakening and a growing awareness of the sheer brutality of the system began to galvanize a wider conscience. The publication of Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1852 was not just a literary sensation, it was a political earthquake. It translated abstract arguments about property rights into a visceral, heartbreaking narrative of families separated, bodies scarred, and souls crushed. The North saw sin. The South saw slander. This ethical awakening collided head-on with the South's increasingly militant defense of their system. Southern intellectuals and politicians moved from simply defending slavery as a necessary evil to proclaiming it a positive good, beneficial to the enslaved, socially stabilizing for the masters, and religiously sanctioned. Their arguments, often steeped in paternalistic delusion, sought to silence all internal dissent and demand external respect. The political arena became the war's first bloody field. Every new territory added to the Union, from Missouri to California, sparked a furious existential battle over whether the institution would follow. The Compromise of 1850, a patchwork solution meant to quell the storm, only fueled greater fury, particularly through the inclusion of the draconian Fugitive Slave Act. This act forced Northern citizens, whether abolitionist or indifferent, to participate actively in the capture and return of runaways. It brought the institution's moral stain directly onto Northern soil, hardening anti-slavery sentiment and transforming principled opposition into actionable resistance. By the mid-1850s, the nation was no longer simply negotiating. It was waiting for the inevitable crack. The economic necessity of the South and the surging moral imperative of the North were an irreconcilable split. The Union, under its tattered flag, held two different civilizations, each fundamentally convinced of the other's destructive wickedness. The question was no longer if they would break apart, but which spark would finally ignite the long, smoldering powder keg. The precarious truce maintained by political compromise shattered decisively with the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, sponsored by Illinois Senator Stephen A. Douglas. The act was a masterstroke of cynical political maneuvering, designed ostensibly to facilitate the construction of a transcontinental railroad and organize the vast western territories. Its hidden destructive power lay in its central doctrine, popular sovereignty. This principle decreed that the residents of the Kansas and Nebraska territories, not Congress, would decide whether slavery would be legal within their borders. By substituting local choice for congressional fiat, the act explicitly repealed the sacred boundary of the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which had prohibited slavery north of the 36 or circa $30 parallel. For the North, this was an unforgivable betrayal, throwing open the gate to slavery's expansion into lands long reserved for freedom. For the South, it was a moment of thrilling, though precarious, victory. The immediate consequence was not a democratic referendum, but a race, a desperate, often violent, dash for control of the soil and the ballot box. Kansas, positioned directly west of the slave state of Missouri, became the epicenter of this national trauma. From the South came the border ruffians. These pro-slavery Missourians, many led by Senator David Rice Atchison, viewed Kansas as their property and any free state settler as an invading abolitionist. They swarmed across the border, determined to secure the territory for the slave economy through intimidation and force. In response, the North began funding and organizing anti-slavery immigrants, known as Free Staters. Groups like the New England Emigrant Aid Company raised money to equip settlers with supplies and, crucially, rifles, infamously dubbed Beecher's Bibles after the abolitionist preacher Henry Ward Beecher, who joked that a rifle was a more persuasive moral agent than a Bible. These Free Staters established strongholds like Lawrence and Topeka, intentionally creating communities founded on the principle of free labor. The first test of popular sovereignty was a farce. In the crucial elections of 1855, hundreds of armed border ruffians rode across the border, cast fraudulent ballots, and then returned home securing a massive, illegitimate majority for the pro-slavery side. The result was the establishment of the pro-slavery Lecompton legislature, which quickly enacted laws so restrictive they were practically a Southern slave code, including the death penalty for helping a slave escape and imprisonment for merely possessing. Abolitionist literature, the Free Staters, refusing to recognize the sham government, formed their own shadow government in Topeka. The political compromise had not led to peace. It had led to two rival governments, each backed by armed citizens staring each other down. The legal process had utterly broken down, replaced by the logic of the rifle. The simmering tension boiled over into open warfare in May 1856. A pro-slavery posse, consisting largely of border ruffians and fueled by territorial court orders, rode into the Free State capital of Lawrence. Though resistance was minimal, the posse proceeded to execute the sack of Lawrence, destroying the Free State Hotel and demolishing the presses of two abolitionist newspapers. The official justification was to enforce the law. The actual result was an act of political terrorism. This act was not met with negotiation, but with brutal, swift retaliation, plunging the territory into outright guerrilla conflict. Kansas was no longer a territory seeking statehood. It was a nation in miniature at civil war. This descent into anarchy, where federal law was ignored, political rights were subverted by force, and blood was shed over the very definition of American liberty, confirmed the fears of many that the sectional crisis had grown too vast, too deeply rooted, and too violent to be solved by any means short of total military confrontation. Kansas was indeed the bloody proving ground. The violence in Kansas was not contained to the prairies. It infected the national political body, poisoning the democratic process itself. By 1860, the country was reeling from the Supreme Court's disastrous Dred Scott decision, 1857, which had declared that black people, free or enslaved, had no rights as citizens and that Congress had no power to prohibit slavery in the territories. This ruling meant to settle the slavery question forever, only intensified it, leading the nation inexorably toward a showdown in the presidential election. The Democratic Party, for decades the only truly national political organization, collapsed under the weight of the sectional crisis. When they met in Charleston, South Carolina, Northern and Southern delegates found themselves speaking two different languages about the future of slavery. The Southern fire eaters demanded a federal slave code for the territories, a demand anathema to Northern Democrats. The party schism was irreversible. Northern Democrats nominated Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois, the champion of the failed doctrine of popular sovereignty. His platform was to maintain the Union through compromise, but his support for popular sovereignty alienated the South. Southern Democrats nominated Vice President John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky, running on a platform demanding federal protection of slavery in all territories. The disintegration of the Democrats revealed a nation fundamentally fractured. A third desperate effort at compromise emerged from aging politicians who formed the Constitutional Union Party, nominating John Bell of Tennessee. Their simple, wistful platform was to know no political principle other than the Constitution of the country, the union of the states, and the enforcement of the laws. They sought to ignore the slavery question entirely, an impossible task. Into this fractured landscape stepped the Republican Party. only 6 years old. This strictly northern anti-slavery expansion party coalesced around a simple, yet revolutionary principle, the containment of slavery. While they promised not to interfere with the institution where it already existed, they were resolutely determined to keep it out of the territories. They nominated Abraham Lincoln of Illinois, a self-made man and a gifted orator who skillfully articulated the moral opposition to slavery with, on December 20th, 1860, South Carolina, long the radical heart of Southern nationalism, unanimously passed an ordinance of secession, declaring the Union dissolved. The nation had held its breath through decades of compromise. Now the election of 1860 had finally exhaled the poisonous air of war. The political crisis had devolved into a crisis of national identity, leaving the remaining states to determine whether the democratic principle was stronger than the bonds of sea. The celebratory bonfires that lit up the North on the night of November 6, 1860, were mirrored by the funeral drums and emergency sirens in the Deep South. Lincoln's victory, achieved without a single Southern electoral vote, was interpreted not merely as a political defeat, but as a deliberate act of aggression. Southern newspaper editorials shrieked of black Republican tyranny, portraying Lincoln as a fanatic who would immediately arm 4 million slaves and orchestrate the destruction of white Southern society. This fear was not entirely irrational. It was the product of decades of self-justification regarding slavery. Having convinced themselves that their system was a positive good, Southern leaders genuinely believed the Republican agenda, to contain slavery and eventually extinguish it, was an attack on their property, their liberty, and their very existence. They believed the Constitution was a compact between sovereign states, and that any violation of the spirit of that compact justified their withdrawal. The election of a purely sectional president, hostile to their primary institution, provided the necessary trigger. The decision was swift, organized, and irreversible. South Carolina, acting on its long-held doctrine of states' rights and nullification, led the charge. On December 20, 1860, in Charleston, the heart of the fire-eating movement, a convention of delegates unanimously voted to secede from the Union. The hall erupted in cheers, and church bells rang out across the city in celebration of what they termed their second independence. The secession crisis then swept through the Deep South like a fever. Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas quickly followed South Carolina's example, exiting the Union throughout January and early February 1861. These 7 states of the Lower South, united by their absolute dependence on cotton and chattel slavery, acted before Lincoln was even inaugurated. The United States government, during this critical period, was frozen in paralysis. President James Buchanan, a timid Democrat whose term was nearing its end, believed secession was unconstitutional, but also argued that the federal government lacked the constitutional authority to prevent it. He was a lame duck president paralyzed by inaction, watching the Union crumble beneath him. His policy was effectively one of temporizing, hoping a final compromise could be brokered, or that Lincoln would somehow solve the mess he was inheriting. During this period of federal impotence, the seceded states moved rapidly to consolidate their independence. On February 4, 1861, delegates from the 7 states met in Montgomery, Alabama, to form the Confederate States of America, CSA. They swiftly drafted a new constitution, remarkably similar to the U.S. Constitution, but with 2 key differences. It explicitly guaranteed the right to hold slaves and required the protection of slavery in any new territory the CSA might acquire. They elected Jefferson Davis of Mississippi, a former U.S. Senator and Secretary of War, as their provisional president. The Confederacy was born, not out of any new revolutionary ideal, but out of a fierce determination to preserve the old economic and racial hierarchy. This shift brought the focus to the few remaining federal military installations scattered throughout the seceded states. Most garrisons were easily taken over by state militias. However, one outpost in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina, became the burning symbol of the conflict. Fort Sumter, Major Robert Anderson, a loyal Kentuckian commanding the federal garrison in Charleston, had cannily moved his small force from the less defensible Fort Moultrie to the imposing unfinished island fortress of Fort Sumter. For the newly declared Confederacy, The sight of the Union flag flying defiantly over their principal harbor was an intolerable offense to their sovereignty. For the Union, Sumter represented the final, tangible presence of federal authority in the South. President Buchanan's feeble attempt to reinforce Anderson in January 1861, sending the unarmed merchant vessel Star of the West, was repelled by Confederate artillery fire. The attempt failed, but no further action was taken. The standoff held through the winter, a silent, tense siege marking the true zero hour of the war. When Abraham Lincoln finally took the oath of office on March 4, 1861, he inherited not a functioning government, but a crisis of separation. In his first inaugural address, Lincoln pleaded with the South, assuring them, "I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists." Yet, he adamantly maintained that the Union was perpetual and that secession was legally void. He closed with an appeal to the better angels of our nature, urging the restoration of the mystic cords of memory that bound the nation, but the better angels were drowned out by the drums of war gathering around Fort Sumter. Lincoln had to choose: abandon Sumter and concede the Confederacy's legitimacy, or resupply it and risk initiating the war. The choice he made, to send a provision convoy, signaling his intent to maintain federal property, forced the Confederacy's hand. On April 12, 1861, before the supply ships could arrive, Confederate batteries opened fire on Fort Sumter. The cannonade was the definitive break, the moment the political crisis died and the Civil War was born. The verdict of the ballot box had been violently rejected, and the fight to determine whether the American experiment, founded on the principle of self-government, could long endure, had officially begun. The dress rehearsal in Kansas had ended. The main performance was now upon the nation. The roar of the cannon at Fort Sumter in April 1861, followed by President Lincoln's call for 75,000 volunteers, had transformed the sectional crisis from a political standoff into a tangible military conflict. The response on both sides was overwhelming, driven by patriotic fervor, naivete, and the absolute conviction that the war would be short, a 90-day romp that would settle the matter decisively. In Washington, D.C., the air was thick with this heady optimism. Society matrons planned picnics and balls for the triumphant return of the troops. Politicians, journalists, and even ordinary citizens eager for a spectacle, prepared to follow the army into the field. The Union objective was simple: strike quickly at the heart of the Confederacy, secure the rebel capital of Richmond, Virginia, and disperse the main Confederate army gathering near Manassas Junction. The key to this plan was the Federal Command's only seasoned force, the 35,000-strong Army of Northeastern Virginia, led by Brigadier General Irvin McDowell. McDowell was a cautious professional, acutely aware that his troops were mostly 3-month volunteers, ill-disciplined and wholly untrained for the realities of battle. He knew his army was unprepared, but political pressure from Lincoln and Congress, clamoring for action before the volunteers' 90-day enlistments expired, overrode his objections. "You are green, it is true," Lincoln conceded, "but they are green also. You are all green alike." On July 16, 1861, under a blistering summer sun, the Grand Army marched out of Washington. The sight was magnificent: long columns of blue, glittering brass, and fluttering flags. It felt less like a march to war and more like a massive celebratory parade. Many soldiers broke ranks to forage, pick blackberries, or visit local farms. Their march speed dictated more by appetite than by military strategy. The Confederate forces, commanded by Brigadier General P.G.T. Beauregard, the victor of Fort Sumter, were equally green, but held a strong defensive position centered near Manassas Junction, a crucial railway hub in northern Virginia. Beauregard's troops stretched along Bull Run, a small river, their line strengthened by reinforcements from the Shenandoah Valley under General Joseph E. Johnston, who had skillfully used the railway network, a crucial advantage in this early stage of the war, to slip past the Federals. McDowell's plan was complex for untrained troops, a flanking maneuver to turn the Confederate left. On the morning of Sunday, July 21st, the battle began with the sound of artillery fire. While a Union feint attacked the Confederate center at the Stone Bridge, the main Federal force executed the wide flank, marching nearly 6 miles around the Confederate left. The strategy worked brilliantly initially. By mid-morning, the Federals, having crossed Bull Run, crashed into the surprised Confederate flank near the farm of the widow Judith Henry. The Confederate line buckled and began to break. Discipline evaporated as regiments crumbled. The promise of a swift Union victory seemed imminent. News of the southern rout even reached the spectators, congressmen, reporters, and ladies in carriages who had followed the army and were watching the action from nearby elevated hills. It was at this moment of crisis, on a low hill known as Henry House Hill, that the illusions of a quick war met the immutable reality of courage and firepower. A Southern brigade, primarily Virginians, held their ground with stoic resolve. Brigadier General Barnard B., attempting to rally his shattered South Carolinians, pointed toward the Virginians commanded by a stern, deeply religious professor from the Virginia Military Institute, Colonel Thomas. Conversely, the victory had an equally detrimental effect on the South. The sudden, overwhelming success led to a wave of damaging overconfidence. Many Confederate soldiers, believing the Federals were cowards and the war was already won, simply went home. Politicians and citizens in Richmond became complacent, convinced that the victory proved their superiority, and that European powers would now surely rush to recognize their independence. This false confidence led to a slowing of mobilization efforts and a reluctance to prepare for the massive, sustained federal effort that Lincoln was already enacting. The road to Richmond remained open, but the political and military landscape had fundamentally changed. Bull Run was the great national sobering up. It marked the moment when the war ceased to be a romantic adventure and became a grim, industrial, existential conflict. The time for illusions was over. The nation was now fully and tragically committed to 4 years of devastating internal warfare, while the Union Army of the Potomac spent the dreary winter of 1861-1862 reorganizing and training near Washington, licking its wounds from the disaster at Bull Run. The strategic map of the war was being irrevocably redrawn 1,000 miles to the west. The Western Theater, encompassing the vast territory between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River, was rapidly proving to be the ground where the Union would find its first and most crucial victories. The core of the Union strategy in the West was the Mississippi River and its major tributaries, particularly the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers. These waterways were the Confederacy's internal lifelines, arteries for commerce, troops, and supplies. Control of these rivers meant cutting the Confederacy in half and gaining direct access to its heartland. This strategic vision found its perfect instrument in a quiet, often overlooked officer named Ulysses S. Grant. Grant was an unlikely hero. A West Point graduate and Mexican-American war veteran, he had resigned from the Army years before under a cloud, struggling in civilian life. Yet the war offered him a second chance, and he seized it with a simple, decisive philosophy: find the enemy and strike them. Unlike his cautious counterparts in the East, Grant prioritized forward movement and unconditional surrender. His rise was meteoric. In February 1862, Grant spearheaded a coordinated land and naval offensive against 2 Confederate strongholds, Fort Henry on the Tennessee River and Fort Donelson on the Cumberland River. The capture of Fort Henry was swift, largely due to the formidable Union gunboats. Fort Donelson, however, provided a fiercer test. When the Confederate commanders requested terms of surrender, Grant's famous reply was curt and uncompromising: "No terms except an unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted. I propose to move immediately upon your works." The surrender of Fort Donelson in mid-February was the first major Union victory of the war, yielding over 12,000 Confederate prisoners and securing Kentucky firmly in the Union column. The victory was hailed across the North, instantly transforming the previously obscure Grant into Unconditional Surrender Grant, the first great Union hero. The Confederate commander in the West, General Albert Sidney Johnston, was forced to abandon Kentucky and most of Tennessee, retreating southward to Corinth, Mississippi, a critical rail junction. Grant, now a major general, pressed his advantage. He moved his reinforced army, now roughly 42,000 strong, up the Tennessee River, disembarking them near a small log church called Shiloh, or the Place of Peace in Hardin County.
Tennessee, Grant's army established a sprawling,
relaxed encampment near Pittsburgh Landing, on the western bank of the river. The troops were not ordered to dig in or construct defensive fortifications. Grant, ever the aggressive optimist, believed he was preparing for an offensive thrust against Corinth, not a defensive battle. Grant himself was a few miles downriver at Savannah, awaiting the arrival of reinforcements under his cautious rival, General Don Carlos Buell. Meanwhile, General Albert Sidney Johnston, under immense pressure to retake the initiative, secretly consolidated his forces, nearly 45,000 men at Corinth. He planned a desperate, coordinated surprise attack on the unsuspecting federal forces at Pittsburgh Landing, intending to destroy Grant's army before Buell could arrive. Johnston understood the stakes. If the Confederacy lost this army, the entire Western theater would be lost. In the early, misty hours of Sunday, April 6, 1862, Johnston's troops burst out of the dense woods. Their attack was a complete surprise. Union pickets, many still drowsy in their tents, were the first to face the onslaught. The initial sound of firing was dismissed by many in the Union camp as merely green troops skirmishing. They were tragically wrong. The Confederacy's desperate gamble had begun, and the tranquil woods near Shiloh Church were about to become the site of the bloodiest single battle in American history up to that point. The price of victory, Grant and the nation would learn, was measured in unimaginable sacrifice by the late summer of 1862. The Confederacy, despite the grinding losses in the West, was riding a wave of confidence in the East. General Robert E. Lee and his Army of Northern Virginia had brilliantly outmaneuvered and defeated the Federals at the Second Battle of Bull Run, driving the Union forces back into the fortifications of Washington, D.C. Emboldened by this success and recognizing a moment of critical opportunity, Lee devised a daring plan, an invasion of the North. Lee's objectives for crossing the Potomac River into Maryland were manifold. First, he hoped to secure provisions and forage his army in unravaged territory. Second, and more importantly, he intended to relieve the pressure on Virginia and influence the upcoming fall elections in the North, potentially strengthening the Democratic Peace Party. Crucially, a major Confederate victory on Union soil might persuade the European powers, particularly Great Britain and France, to formally recognize the Confederacy's independence, offering a lifeline that could win the war. The invasion, however, began poorly. Lee's forces were exhausted, ill-equipped, and poorly fed. As Lee's veterans marched across the Potomac, tens of thousands of stragglers, worn down by continuous campaigning, fell out of the ranks, quickly eroding his numerical strength. Opposing him was the massive but consistently cautious Army of the Potomac, once again under the command of Major General George B. McClellan. McClellan had a unique relationship with the Army. His men adored him for his superb organizational skills and genuine care for their welfare, but President Lincoln was constantly frustrated by his general's crippling hesitation and tendency to overestimate the enemy's strength. The opportunity to destroy Lee's army presented itself to McClellan in one of the most remarkable coincidences of the war. On September 13, 1862, near Frederick, Maryland, 2 Union corporals found a package wrapped around 3 cigars lying in a field. Inside was a copy of Lee's detailed battle plan, Special Orders Number 191. This lost order laid out the exact disposition of the Confederate Army, revealing that Lee had recklessly divided his forces to capture the Federal garrison at Harper's Ferry, leaving his main command dangerously exposed. "Here is a paper with which, if I cannot whip Bobby Lee, I will be willing to go home," McClellan reportedly exclaimed. He possessed the strategic equivalent of the enemy's playbook. A swift, aggressive attack could have crushed Lee's fragmented army. However, true to form, McClellan paused, taking a full 18 hours to organize his forces for the pursuit. This delay was catastrophic, allowing Lee just enough time to realize his error and concentrate his scattered forces near the quiet farming community of Sharpsburg, Maryland, positioning his army behind the natural defensive line of Antietam Creek. On the morning of September 17, 1862, the stage was set for the bloodiest single day in American military history. The battle did not unfold as a single, coordinated engagement, but as 3 distinct, savage fights that rolled sequentially down the Confederate left, center, and right flanks. The first blow landed just after dawn on the Confederate left flank, anchored by Stonewall Jackson. Union General Joseph Hooker's corps plunged into a 20-acre cornfield owned by David Miller. The fighting here was murderous, an absolute inferno of close-quarters combat. Confederate lines dissolved and reformed in the dense stalks. Hooker later wrote that every stalk in that cornfield was cut down as closely as could have been done with a knife. Line after line of men marched into the field, only to be pulverized by massed rifle and artillery fire. The combat was so intense that the ground shifted hands multiple times, earning the spot the grim moniker, the Cornfield of Death. Despite the unimaginable ferocity of the morning attacks, Union forces failed to achieve a decisive breakthrough. The inability of Union commanders to coordinate their attacks and commit their reserves meant that each assault was met piecemeal by Lee's army, which fought with desperate, unyielding courage, holding their ground in a brutal defensive stalemate. The rising sun of September 17th had shone on a crisp autumn morning. By midday, it illuminated a terrifying vista of smoke, deafening noise, and unprecedented carnage. Defensive stalemate at Antietam in September 1862 provided President Abraham Lincoln with the critical military victory, or at least the strategic non-defeat he had been patiently awaiting. For 18 months, Lincoln had insisted the war was solely about preserving the Union, famously stating, "If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that." Yet Lincoln was a shrewd political realist and a deep moral thinker. He understood that the war for Union could not be won without confronting the root cause of the conflict: slavery. Every slave cultivating a crop or digging an entrenchment in the South freed a white man to fight the Union. Slavery was, quite literally, the Confederacy's greatest strategic asset. Targeting it was not just a moral necessity, it was a military imperative. Long before Antietam, political pressures had been building. Radical Republicans and abolitionists were fiercely demanding that Lincoln strike a decisive blow against the peculiar institution. They saw the war as God's judgment on a slaveholding nation, and any temporizing was seen as moral weakness. Lincoln, however, feared that any premature decree might drive the loyal border states, Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri, slave states that had remained in the Union, into the waiting arms of the Confederacy, fatally compromising the war effort. Lincoln's plan evolved slowly, carefully balancing strategic necessity with political prudence. He had initially favored a gradual, compensated emancipation that would be voluntary for the states. But that compromise was soundly rejected by both border state and Confederate representatives. By the summer of 1862, he had moved to a more radical course. He wrote the first draft of the Emancipation Proclamation entirely on his own, justifying it not as a moral declaration, but as a necessary war measure designed to crush the rebellion. In July 1862, he presented the draft to his cabinet. The reaction was mixed, but the decisive advice came from Secretary of State William H. Seward. Seward recognized the moral power of the decree but cautioned against issuing it immediately. He argued that to issue such a pivotal decree after a string of demoralizing Union defeats would make the proclamation look like the last shriek on the retreat, a desperate, weak move by a failing government. Seward insisted that the proclamation must follow a clear Union military success, giving it the necessary weight and authority. Lincoln quietly pocketed the draft and waited for a victory. That victory arrived, however ambiguously, after the savage fighting near Antietam Creek. While tactically a draw, General Robert E. Lee's army was forced to retreat back into Virginia, ending the Confederate threat to northern soil. Lincoln finally had the political moment he required. 5 days after the Battle of Antietam, on September 22, 1862, President Lincoln convened his cabinet and announced his decision. He presented the proclamation not as a subject for debate, but as a commitment already made, declaring that he had promised God to issue the decree if the Confederates were driven out of Maryland. The initial, preliminary Emancipation Proclamation stipulated that all enslaved people in states or parts of states still in rebellion against the United States as of January 1, 1863, would be thenceforward and forever free. Crucially, it applied only to areas where the Union had no authority, the Confederate states, and specifically exempted the loyal border, states and areas of the Confederacy already under Union military control. The immediate reaction was explosive. In the North, abolitionists and radical Republicans rejoiced, finally seeing the war elevated to a moral crusade. Border state politicians and Northern Democrats, however, were furious, arguing that Lincoln had betrayed his original purpose and transformed the war into a revolutionary struggle for abolition. In the Confederacy, the decree was met with outrage and defiance, solidifying their resolve to fight until the bitter end. Yet its true revolutionary power lay in the millions of enslaved men, women, and children who now viewed the approaching Union Army not as an invader, but as an army of liberation, fundamentally changing the nature of the Union cause. The spring of 1863 was a season of soaring hope for the Confederate States. The Emancipation Proclamation had been issued, transforming the war's moral objective, yet its immediate military impact was muted. In May, General Robert E. Lee had delivered a stunning victory at Chancellorsville, routing a numerically superior Union army, albeit at the heavy cost of losing his indispensable Lieutenant Stonewall Jackson. Lee's genius seemed boundless, the Army of Northern Virginia invincible. This military success provided the political leverage Lee needed to launch his second and greatest invasion of the North. His strategic goals were ambitious, echoing those of the Antietam campaign: relieve Virginia, draw the fighting out of the ravaged Shenandoah Valley, and give the farmers of Virginia a season to harvest their crops in peace. Gather supplies, forage the rich farmland of Pennsylvania for desperately needed food, horses, and material. Shatter Northern morale. A major Confederate victory on Union soil, perhaps the capture of a key city like Harrisburg or Philadelphia, would crush Northern resolve, increase the strength of the peace movement, and put immense political pressure on President Lincoln, secure recognition, most critically, a victory in Pennsylvania, coinciding with the massive Union loss at Chancellorsville, would surely convince Great Britain and France that the Confederacy was a viable, independent nation, forcing them to intervene diplomatically or militarily. The war could be won by European recognition. In early June 1863, Lee's veteran army, numbering approximately 75,000 men, began its audacious march north through the Blue Ridge Mountains and into Pennsylvania. Opposing him was the Army of the Potomac, now under the command of yet another new general, Major General George Gordon Meade. Meade had replaced the ineffective Joseph Hooker just 3 days before the pivotal engagement. Meade, a meticulous and sometimes prickly Pennsylvanian, was entirely unknown to the Army's rank and file, but was determined to shield Washington and Baltimore. He maneuvered his 90,000-strong army north, cautiously shadowing Lee, trying to position his forces between the Confederates and the two major northern cities. The armies converged on a small, insignificant crossroads town in south-central Pennsylvania, Gettysburg. The convergence was almost entirely accidental. Confederate General Henry Heth, acting on a rumor that there was a large supply of shoes in the town, sent his division there on the morning of July 1, 1863. Instead of shoes, Heth found the advanced cavalry division of the Union Army, led by the brilliant General John Buford. Buford immediately grasped the strategic importance of the low ridges west of Gettysburg, realizing they offered the only defensive advantage in the area. He dismounted his cavalry, deploying them as skirmishers to slow the Confederate advance and buy time for the main Union infantry to arrive. The fighting that erupted that morning quickly escalated from a skirmish into a full-scale battle. Buford's defense was desperate but effective, holding off Heth's infantry long enough for the 1st Union Infantry Corps, commanded by General John F. Reynolds, to arrive. Tragically, Reynolds, one of the Union's most respected officers, was killed moments after arriving on the field, a tremendous early loss. Throughout the afternoon, waves of Confederate infantry poured onto the field, overwhelming the Union line stretched along McPherson's Ridge and Oak Hill. Despite the heroic efforts of the Federals, particularly the famous Iron Brigade, the sheer weight of the Confederate attack, led by the divisions of A.P. Hill and Richard Ewell, was too much to withstand. By late afternoon, the battered remnants of the Union Corps were routed, driven back through the streets of Gettysburg in confused retreat. It was a clear tactical victory for the Confederacy on the first day. The crucial turning point, however, occurred that evening. Driven south through the town, the Federals rallied on the high ground just south of Gettysburg, a line of hills culminating in Cemetery Hill and the prominent elevation of Cemetery Ridge. General Ewell, replacing the fallen Jackson, chose not to immediately attack the exhausted, retreating Federals who were exposed on the heights. This hesitation, later considered a fatal error, allowed the Federals to establish a powerful, concave defensive position, often described as a fishhook, that would prove impregnable over the next 2 days. The cost of foreign recognition had suddenly materialized, not in a grand, decisive stroke, but in the chaotic, bloody fields of a small Pennsylvania town. Lee had successfully drawn the Union Army into battle, but he had lost the element of surprise, and the enemy now held the high ground. The next 2 days would determine whether the Confederacy could turn their tactical opening into a strategic victory, and whether the great nations of Europe would ever recognize the slaveholding republic, even as the vast armies of the East converged at Gettysburg. The war's most decisive strategic blow was being hammered out on the steep bluffs overlooking the Mississippi River. The Union victory at Antietam had changed the war's moral purpose, but the fall of Vicksburg, Mississippi, would irrevocably change the war's geography and military balance, effectively implementing the core of the Union's Anaconda Plan, isolating the Deep South and severing the Confederacy into 2 powerless halves. The strategic importance of Vicksburg could not be overstated. Perched high atop a crescent of formidable hills, the city earned the nickname, the Gibraltar of the Confederacy. It was the last major Confederate stronghold controlling the entire Mississippi River. As long as Vicksburg held, the Confederacy could shuttle vital men, horses, cattle, and supplies between its rich western states, Texas, Arkansas, and Louisiana, and the beleaguered armies in the East. Lincoln himself declared, "Vicksburg is the key. The war can never be brought to a close until that key is in our pocket." For months, General Ulysses S. Grant, the hero of Shiloh, had struggled to find a way to take the citadel. The natural terrain seemed to mock every Union attempt. North of the city, the land was a disease-ridden maze of swamps, bayous, and twisting river channels, making a direct approach impossible. Previous attempts throughout the winter of 1862-1863, including digging canals and trying to navigate impossible waterways, had ended in frustration, sickness, and ridicule from northern newspapers. The public and many in Washington began to question whether Grant possessed the mental acuity or sobriety required for the task. Grant, however, possessed an iron will and a rare, fluid, strategic mind. Recognizing that a direct frontal assault was suicidal, he conceived a high-risk, audacious plan that violated every conventional military doctrine. The plan involved moving his army south along the treacherous western bank of the Mississippi, a journey of over 50 miles, while simultaneously using the powerful Union gunboat fleet, commanded by Admiral David Dixon Porter, to run the gauntlet of Vicksburg's powerful river batteries. On the dark, moonless night of April 16, 1863, Porter's fleet made its desperate dash. The Confederate batteries opened up with a furious bombardment, lighting the river with shell bursts and fires. Grant's soldiers watching from the riverbank were mesmerized by the terrible beauty and risk. Despite taking heavy fire, the majority of the fleet, protected by bales of cotton and ingenuity, successfully slipped past the guns and met Grant's army south of the city. The next phase of the campaign proved Grant's genius. Having successfully crossed the Mississippi into Confederate territory below Vicksburg, a move that completely baffled Confederate General John C. Pemberton, Vicksburg's commander, Grant cut off his supply lines and, for nearly 3 weeks, led his army of 45,000 men on a brilliant, lightning-fast campaign. Abandoning the military axiom of supply dependency, Grant announced, "My troops can subsist upon the country." Grant's army marched nearly 200 miles, fought and won 5 major battles: Port Gibson, Raymond, Jackson, Champion Hill, and Big Black River Bridge, and captured the state capital of Jackson, destroying its infrastructure and supply depots. His goal was to keep the Confederate forces off balance, preventing the 2 main Confederate armies in the area, Pemberton's Vicksburg garrison and General Joseph E. Johnston's relief forces, from uniting. The maneuver worked perfectly. Johnston, cautious and hesitant, failed to support Pemberton. Grant, having completely disrupted the enemy's defense, drove Pemberton's forces back into the fortified perimeter of Vicksburg itself. By May 18, 1863, The victorious Union Army had completed its encirclement, trapping Pemberton's entire command and the city's civilian population within its formidable defenses. The final arduous phase, the siege, was about to begin. The fate of the Mississippi, and with it the strategic heart of the Confederacy, rested on the inevitable outcome of Grant's brilliant gamble. By the spring of 1864, the strategic landscape of the Civil War had been fundamentally redrawn. The dual victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg in July 1863 had ended the Confederacy's hopes of foreign recognition and had successfully severed the rebel states along the Mississippi River. The South was shrinking, its resources dwindling, but the Army of Northern Virginia, under the genius of General Robert E. Lee, remained intact and defiant. To finally break the stalemate in the East and utilize the Union's vast superiority in manpower and industry, President Lincoln needed a commander who possessed the will to match the resources. That man was Ulysses S. Grant. In March 1864, Grant was summoned east, promoted to lieutenant general, a rank previously held only by George Washington, and given command of all Union armies. He made his headquarters with the Army of the Potomac, placing himself in direct opposition to Lee. Grant brought with him a new, grim strategic vision, the strategy of attrition and constant pressure. The previous Union generals in the East, McClellan, Pope, Burnside, Hooker, and Meade, had focused on maneuver, attempting to capture the Confederate capital of Richmond or outflank Lee, but always retreating after a major setback. Grant's philosophy was different. He recognized that the Confederacy was running out of men and the Union was not. His goal was not territory, but the destruction of Lee's army. From this point forward, the Union Army would accept high casualties if it meant inflicting equally high and ultimately irreplaceable casualties on the Confederacy. There would be no retreat, only constant forward motion. Grant's plan was a coordinated squeeze across the entire continent. He ordered General William T. Sherman to destroy the Confederate heartland from the west, while he would personally engage Lee in the east, neutralizing the Confederacy's greatest field army. The overland campaign begins, the Wilderness. The relentless campaign began on May 4, 1864, as the Army of the Potomac, numbering over 118,000 men, crossed the Rapidan River, marching into an infamous patch of dense second-growth forest in northern Virginia known as the Wilderness. Lee, recognizing the strategic importance of denying the Federals maneuver room, immediately threw his 60,000 veterans into the tangled thicket. The resulting battle, fought on May 5th and 6th, was unlike anything seen before. Visibility was often reduced to mere yards. Artillery proved useless in the dense growth, and coordinated command was impossible. Regiments clashed suddenly in the underbrush, fighting hand-to-hand in a claustrophobic hell. To make the carnage worse, the dry brush and pines caught fire, adding the horror of burning wounded men to the gruesome battlefield. The air was thick with smoke, the cries of the injured, and the sickening stench of burning flesh. The two-day battle was a tactical draw, but a gruesome bloodbath. The Union suffered nearly 18,000 casualties, the Confederates about 11,000. Under previous Union command, a loss of this magnitude would have meant a retreat back across the Rapidan. But Grant was different. After the fighting subsided on the 7th, instead of retreating north, he ordered his columns to disengage and march south and east, around Lee's flank, toward the strategic crossroads of Spotsylvania. As the weary, bloodied Union soldiers realized they were heading deeper into enemy territory, not retreating, they erupted in spontaneous cheers. They finally had a general who would not back down. Lee, masterfully anticipating Grant's move, raced his army to intercept. The struggle had evolved into a savage head-to-head foot race for Richmond, with Grant determined to stay engaged and Lee determined to block him. The constant pressure had begun, and the North was about to learn the brutal price of victory. By the autumn of 1864, the final, terrifying phase of the Union strategy was unleashed. While General Grant locked General Lee in a death grip at Petersburg, the Western theater was commanded by a man who fully grasped the grim arithmetic of attrition, Major General William Tecumseh Sherman. Sherman and Grant were intellectual complements. Where Grant believed in destroying the enemy army, Sherman believed in destroying the enemy's will to fight. The Confederacy was already economically exhausted. but its people clung to the belief that the Union was too weak-willed to complete the task. Southern morale remained resilient, fueled by the hope that Northern war weariness would lead to a political victory in the upcoming 1864 presidential election. To crush this final hope, Sherman needed a move so audacious and so destructive that it would convince the entire Confederate populace that their cause was lost. This strategic concept was known as total war. It was a departure from traditional warfare that only targeted military forces. Total war meant targeting the enemy's resources, infrastructure, railroads, factories, farms, and, crucially, their civilian morale. It was a strategy of making war so terrible, as Sherman put it, that they will cease to be belligerents. The fall of Atlanta, the preliminary step to this great march, was the capture of Atlanta, Georgia. Atlanta was the most vital industrial and transportation hub remaining in the Deep South. Sherman spent the summer of 1864 in a brilliant, grinding campaign of maneuver against the elusive Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston. After Johnston was replaced by the more aggressive General John Bell Hood, the Confederates launched a series of desperate assaults that failed to break the siege. On September 2, 1864, Hood's army was forced to evacuate, and Sherman marched his troops into the smoldering city. The capture of Atlanta was not just a military victory. It was a devastating psychological and political triumph. It dominated Northern newspaper headlines, ensuring President Lincoln's re-election in November and extinguishing the Confederacy's last realistic hope for a negotiated peace. There would be no retreat from the war effort now. With Atlanta secured, Sherman proposed his great unprecedented gamble to Grant and Lincoln: abandon his supply line, leave a portion of his army to guard the rear, and march the remaining 62,000 men across the state of Georgia to the Atlantic coast, living off the land as they went. Grant, initially hesitant, fully backed the plan once he grasped its terrifying psychological potential. The march begins on November 15, 1864, after ensuring that all military and industrial structures in Atlanta were systematically burned, a spectacular, horrifying conflagration that marked the city's symbolic death. Sherman's massive army stepped out of the city and vanished. They had cut the telegraph wires. For a month, the North had no direct communication, and the South had only the terror-stricken reports of refugees. Sherman's army was organized into two wings, marching parallel columns 20 to 40 miles apart. Their target was Savannah, 285 miles away. The objective of the march was to leave a scar so deep that recovery would be impossible. The Union troops, known as Sherman's bummers, foragers, were ordered to seize all necessary provisions, food, livestock, corn, from civilian homes and plantations. What they could not consume or carry, they were authorized to destroy. The sight was apocalyptic for the civilians in the path. The army created a 60-mile wide path of systematic destruction across the heart of Georgia. Railroad tracks were torn up, heated over bonfires, and twisted around trees, creating the infamous Sherman's neckties, irreparable symbols of the Confederacy's crippled infrastructure. Cotton gins, factories, and mills were gutted. Sherman's march was not wanton, undisciplined barbarity. It was calculated, disciplined terror aimed at breaking the civilian support base for the Confederate war machine. While there were documented cases of individual atrocities and theft, the destruction was primarily economic and infrastructural, designed to strip the South of its capacity to feed its armies. The psychological warfare had begun, forcing the people of Georgia to confront the utter helplessness of their government to protect them. By the spring of 1865, the Confederate States of America was a dying entity, held together only by the sheer will of its people and the formidable reputation of General Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. For 9 long months, Grant's massive Union army had locked Lee's forces in the brutal, grinding trench warfare of the Siege of Petersburg. This siege, south of the Confederate capital of Richmond, had become the ultimate expression of Grant's strategy of attrition, a slow, merciless drain on Southern manpower, resources, and hope the Confederacy was starving. General Sherman's march had obliterated its primary agricultural states. The Union naval blockade had strangled its ports, and the railroad network was crippled. Lee's army, though still fighting with heroic determination, was ragged, malnourished, and shrinking daily from desertion. They faced an enemy that was perpetually reinforced, superbly equipped, and supported by a populace that had just overwhelmingly re-elected Abraham Lincoln on a platform of unconditional surrender. Grant, ever the methodical hammer, extended his line slowly to the west and south, forcing Lee to stretch his thinning forces to the breaking point. The Confederate defense had become a taut wire, and Grant was determined to find the snap, the breakthrough at Petersburg. The breaking point came in late March 1865. On March 29, 1865, Grant launched a decisive flanking movement aimed at the vital South Side Railroad, Lee's last supply line into Petersburg. Lee, sensing the end, committed his last reserves to block the Federal move. The climax arrived on April 1st at the Battle of Five Forks. Union cavalry under General Philip Sheridan, supported by infantry, smashed through the Confederate right flank. The victory was total, crippling the remaining Confederate defenses and leaving Lee's rear hopelessly exposed. Upon receiving the disastrous news, Grant immediately ordered a massive general assault along the entire Petersburg front for the following morning. The Federals poured over the trenches that had held them at bay for 9 months. Confederate lines dissolved into chaos. General A.P. Hill, one of Lee's most capable lieutenants, was killed trying to rally his troops. The city of Petersburg was indefensible. On the morning of Sunday, April 2nd, Lee sent a terse telegram to Confederate President Jefferson Davis in Richmond. "I advise that all preparations be made to abandon our positions tonight." The fall of Richmond, the evacuation order plunged the Confederate capital into utter pandemonium. For 4 years, Richmond had symbolized the Confederate cause. Now it was being abandoned. Government officials, citizens, and soldiers scrambled to board the few remaining trains. To prevent Union forces from seizing valuable war material, Confederate authorities ordered the burning of warehouses, factories, and military stores. The controlled demolition quickly spiraled out of control. Fires spread through the downtown area, consuming factories, arsenals, and large sections of the commercial district. Mobs descended on the abandoned stores, looting and drinking. The city that had defied the Union for so long was collapsing from within, consumed by anarchy and flame. On the morning of April 3, 1865, the first Union troops, black cavalry regiments, rode into the smoking, shattered capital. The sight was electrifying. Later that day, President Lincoln himself, having traveled from Washington, walked through the streets of Richmond, largely unescorted, among the newly freed slaves who recognized him and cheered their liberator. The symbolic collapse of the Confederacy was complete. The capital had fallen, and the very people the rebellion was fought to enslave were celebrating their freedom under the Union flag. The retreat to Appomattox, meanwhile, Lee and the remnants of his army, now numbering barely 30,000 half-starved men, began a desperate race west, hoping to escape Grant and link up with General Johnston's forces in North Carolina. Grant and the Army of the Potomac, sensing the end, drove their pursuit with relentless fervor. The chase lasted a week, a heartbreaking trial for the once proud Army of Northern Virginia. Without food and constantly harassed by Sheridan's fast-moving cavalry, Lee's veterans were reduced to gnawing on parched corn and marching on sheer exhaustion. Every few hours, the pursuing Federals were on their heels, capturing supply trains and cutting off retreat routes. The war was no longer about territory or maneuver. It was a simple matter of logistics and survival, and Lee was running out of both. The surrender at Appomattox in April 1865 brought an end to the bloodiest chapter in American history, ushering in a brief, intoxicating moment of national euphoria. The Union was saved, the armies disbanded, and the horrific institution of slavery, the moral fault line that had caused the war, was dead, formalized by the imminent ratification of the 13th Amendment. 4 million men, women, and children, who had been deemed mere chattel property, were now citizens in waiting, tasting freedom for the first time. Yet, as the smoke cleared, the magnitude of the task ahead became terrifyingly clear. The physical and economic devastation of the South was immense, but the true challenge lay in the social and political vacuum. The war had destroyed the planter aristocracy's social order, but it had not yet built a new one. The process of integrating these 4 million freedmen, into the American political body, a process known as Reconstruction, would prove to be a contest as bitter, complex, and potentially revolutionary as the war itself. The immediate reality of freedom, for the newly freed people, Freedom was a profound, immediate gift, often celebrated by adopting new surnames, formalizing marriages, and searching desperately for family members sold away years before. But this liberty came with no resources. They were landless, penniless, and without formal education, standing in a hostile society that was culturally and economically determined to keep them subordinate. The first essential institution of Reconstruction was the Bureau of Refugees. Freedmen and Abandoned Lands, the Freedmen's Bureau, established by Congress in March 1865. Though woefully underfunded and understaffed, the Bureau served as the only federal presence in the vast hostile South. Its mission was immense: distribute rations, mediate labor contracts between former slaves and former masters, establish schools, and provide legal aid. It was an unprecedented experiment in federal social welfare, a fragile bridge between slavery and citizenship. The key to true independence, however, was land. The dream of the freedmen was to own their own soil, often encapsulated in the promise of 40 acres and a mule, an idea born from General Sherman's wartime order to temporarily settle black families on confiscated lands in South Carolina and Georgia. But that promise remained largely unfulfilled, blocked by political opposition and respect for white property rights. Without land, most freedmen were forced to return to work on plantations, creating a new economic servitude called sharecropping. The assassination and the political vacuum. The political architect of the Union's victory, Abraham Lincoln, was tragically denied the chance to oversee the peace. Just days after the end of the war, Lincoln was assassinated by Confederate sympathizer John Wilkes Booth. His death created a catastrophic political vacuum and fundamentally altered the course of Reconstruction. Lincoln had favored a relatively lenient 10% plan, which would allow Southern states to re-enter the Union quickly once 10% of their 1860 voters swore loyalty and accepted emancipation. His focus was reunification with malice toward none. The new president, Andrew Johnson of Tennessee, a war Democrat and the only Southern senator to remain loyal to the Union, held a radically different vision. Johnson, a staunch white supremacist, possessed a deep animosity toward the Southern planter elite but no sympathy for the cause of black equality. He launched his own, highly lenient Reconstruction plan during the summer of 1865, while Congress was recessed. Johnson offered mass pardons to most former Confederates, excluding the wealthiest planters, allowing them to regain control of state governments. The returning Southern legislatures, operating under Johnson's permissive policy, immediately passed the notorious Black Codes. These laws were designed to retain white supremacy and control black labor, restricting freedmen's rights to own property, bear arms, and serve on juries, and often forcing them into annual labor contracts under penalty of arrest. These codes confirmed the worst fears of Northern Republicans, that the South intended to substitute a form of semi-slavery for the institution itself. The stage was set for a titanic constitutional showdown between President Johnson, determined to restore the white South to power, and the radical Republicans in Congress, who believed that the war sacrifice demanded a true revolution in Southern society and a genuine guarantee of civil and political rights for the freedmen. The promised land of freedom was quickly turning into a battleground for the very definition of American citizenship.